Так, я думаю, можна починати потроху, вже трохи затримались.
I think we should begin. It's about time. Greetings to everyone. Today we have yet another meeting and training with our American friends who have been helping with educating us for over a year already. We are welcoming T.Bartone today, a colonel retired and a PhD. And the topic of our discussion today is about building a Hardiness mindset for resilience in facing loss. We will have our lecture for about an hour, and then we will have 30 minutes for questions. Please write your questions in the chat. You have this opportunity here, or you can raise your hand and I will call you one by one, and you will have an opportunity to ask your question. The training will be recorded. You will have a chance to read it on our four-post YouTube channel. Sometimes they are posted slightly later, but we try still to do it. We have interpretation function available. If you need to listen to the lecture in Ukrainian, you will need to find a globe sign down on your panel in Zoom and select Ukrainian as your language of preference. If you want original audio, you can just do nothing, or you can select English, and then you will only hear English today. Before I give the floor to our speaker, we have Zoran Komark too. Please confirm that he has seen my action. So, Paul, over to you then. And we can run the presentation, I guess.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. And thank you to Dr. Martin and Dr. Castro for the invitation to speak with you today. The first thing I wish to say is that to all of our Ukrainian friends and colleagues, our hearts and our prayers are with you every day. And we really are following the struggles that you're in with great care and sympathy, and praying for you and for your success. So today I wish to speak with you about hardiness and how building a hardiness mindset, if you will, helps you to remain strong and resilient in the face of a whole range of stresses, including the loss of loved ones. And I'll speak more about how you, specifically how you can build your hardiness, some techniques and strategies for building hardiness as we go along. To the next slide, please. Or do I advance the slides? Please to the next slide. Good. Okay, perfect. So, well, it's no secret that stress is a part of life, whether it's on the job stress, a whole range of very stressful jobs that bring daily challenges, but also, you know, financial problems, relationship problems, or, you know, more severe stressors like death and the loss of a loved one. It's part of life. However, it's good to remember that most of the time, most people are pretty resilient in dealing with stress. We cope pretty effectively. At the same time, sometimes it just builds up to a point it gets overwhelming, and when that happens, all kinds of negative consequences can result. Stress-related physical health problems, heart disease, high blood pressure, a whole range of immune system problems that can come up as a result of stress. Also, of course, drug and alcohol problems, even in more severe cases, suicide. So stress is something that is with us every day, but and we're pretty resilient, but we really, it's a good thing to dig in a little bit to resilience and just what are the factors that contribute to resilience and help us to stay healthy and strong despite the stresses that we're dealing with in life. Next slide, please. I'll just jump ahead. And so, well, what goes into resilience? And of course, there's a lot of talk these days about resilience, but there's, arguably less discussion about what are the factors that help people to be resilient. And there's really a whole range. I'm going to be talking about hardiness, but there are lots of other factors that influence resilience as well, and that we should be aware of and pay attention to. Yes, it's true that our genetic background, hereditary factors make a contribution, surely, as they do to a whole lot of other human attributes. Early environment certainly makes an impact, which in turn contributes to, generally how we think about personality. Of course, social support from the people around us, in particular from our families, maybe from our co-workers, is a very important factor contributing to resilience. And in general, the contemporary environment, the environment around us, is going to either, help or detract from how effectively we are able to cope with the stresses and challenges that we are confronted with in life. To the next slide, please. And so here today, I'm talking about mainly hardiness, which I'm looking for the slide to advance, please. Right. Okay, well, the slide doesn't say a whole lot, but the point here is that hardiness is what I like to describe as the number one, the most important inside the person or inside of the skin factor influencing resilience. Now, as we just said, lots of factors can affect resilience and coping, but from the perspective of what is inside of us that we carry with us day to day, hardiness, I believe, to be the most important of those factors. Next slide, please. So where does this hardiness concept come from? Well, it's not a new idea. It was actually first discovered, I think is a reasonable way to put it, but it was first identified by researchers at the University of Chicago way back in the early 1980s, where researchers there were studying very high stress executives and managers happen to be in the telecommunications industry. And it was very much an empirical study where they set out to identify what were the distinguishing personality dimensions that separated executives, high stress executives who continued to do well and thrive and perform well and stay healthy from another group that showed a lot of signs of stress-related illness. And I'm not going to go into great details on the study, but simply to say it was very carefully done, actually a series of studies, very carefully done. And what the researchers came up with was these three factors, which are, labeled as commitment, control, and challenge. And these three factors, well, let's go to the next slide, please. And they summarized the three as hardiness. Now, okay, I believe the sequence here is challenge, commitment, and control. At any rate, let me say what challenge is, first of all. Challenge really is a tendency to look at changing circumstances in life as interesting and worthwhile, exciting, things that, although it may be disruptive and in some respects stressful, it's interesting and a chance to learn. People who are high in the challenge facet of hardiness tend to enjoy novelty and variety in life. They actually they tend to seek variety in life, and they appreciate it. Commitment, the second facet of hardiness, is really about a sense of purpose and meaning in life. People who are high in commitment are very interested in life. They're engaged with life, and that includes, there's an existential theoretical background to the hardiness concept, which we won't have time to go into today, but it's very much grounded in existential theory. Think about Viktor Frankl and a number of others. But you see that primarily in this dimension of commitment, which is really about purpose and meaning in life. People high in hardiness commitment see life as interesting, worthwhile, even when maybe things aren't going well. It's still interesting. Control really is a more familiar concept. It's really the belief that or the viewpoint that your actions make a difference, that what you do has an important influence on outcome, which is not to say that, we think that, the high hardy control person is a naive optimist thinking he or she can control everything. No, life doesn't work that way. But in general, it's the sense that, yes, my actions make a difference. And, that translates into into behaviors in terms of how the high hardy, high control person tends to approach stressful conditions in life. And the last thing I want to say here, and before we go on, is that although we can speak about hardiness in terms of these three facets or dimensions or factors, they really do work together in a synergistic way. They reinforce each other and work together. So it's a situation where the whole is more than the sum of the parts. Although I will say, as an aside, you know, a lot of psychologists are still very mechanistic in their thinking, and there's a fairly common tendency to want to break down complex constructs like hardiness or whatever it may be into subcomponents and then analyze and try to identify, well, which is the really important factor, and then we can throw the others away and focus on just that. And that's been done with hardiness. And, you know, it can be worthwhile when you're doing research to examine the contribution, the relative contribution of commitment, control, and challenge. But it's always important to come back to the overall concept of hardiness and look at how that works, because the facets really do work together. Okay, I'm digressing a bit, but let's go to the next slide. So in the early days of hardiness, and I mentioned it's been around for 40 years or so, so there's been a lot of work on the concept. In the early days, early years, it was primarily seen as something really quite fixed or stable in persons. It doesn't change very much once it's formed in early childhood experience. So it was pretty much seen as a personality trait, which you can, you know, I've kind of represented the trait perspective on the left side of this continuum. Nowadays, actually, we're, I may say, a bit more knowledgeable, more sophisticated. And there have been a lot of studies that have shown that hardiness, yeah, it is partly a trait, but it's also partly a state. It's not fixed for all time. It can change depending upon a variety of things, including the current environment that you're in. It can change depending upon specific, perhaps unusual experiences. It can change based on training, and we'll talk a bit more about that later on. And it can also change as a result of one's own concerted efforts to change your mindset. That's why in recent years we've come to speak more about the hardiness mindset, because a mindset, although it can be, you know, relatively stable over time, it's possible nonetheless to change it, to develop, to modify your mindset and how you think about things. And in the case of hardiness, it's really a mindset that it's quite global, and it affects how you approach and how you perceive, really, the entire world around you. So in the terminology of one of the great psychologists that came before, Gordon Allport, who spoke about worldviews. Hardiness is kind of a worldview, if you like that terminology. But the point here is that it is possible to change, to develop your hardiness. And that's good news. That's good news for all of us. To the next slide, please. Now, I know at this point, let's see, we have 30 or so people tuned in. At this point, I kind of have the sense that although I can't see all of your faces, some of you may be saying, Oh, this is great. Hardiness. One more psychological concept for us to think about that is supposed to help resilience. We'll throw it in the hopper along with what? Self-efficacy, grit, mindfulness. So the question really comes up, well, what is the evidence base for this concept? And I just want to quickly go through a few studies, most of which have been done really just in the last 3 to 5 years, although there's a couple that go back a little further in time. And I'm not going to go into details. I'm just going to give you the highlights. Okay, but suffice it to say, there really is a very solid empirical base, a scientific basis for the hardiness concept and how hardiness operates in terms of its the power of hardiness to buffer or to reduce the negative impact of stress on various unwelcome outcomes, whether that's drug and alcohol abuse, performance declines, or physical or mental health problems. Okay, let's go to the next slide. The first study to briefly mention, and on all of these, I've put the reference down at the bottom of the slide for anyone who really wants to know more or delve into details. You can look it up, or if you can't find the study, you can either email me and I'll send it to you, or just Google on Bartone ResearchGate, which is a kind of an archive for scientific reports. And most of these studies are free up there, available for download. So the first study was one I did at National Defense University when I was teaching there. And we administered the hardiness, a version of the hardiness test, and looked at, we had access to physical health data, and in particular data on cardiovascular health. What we found was that hardiness was associated with those students, and these are mid-career professionals in the national security world, military as well as civilian. And those who were high in hardiness were healthier in terms of lower body fat, in terms of lower cholesterol, and this whole series of biomedical markers that are essentially precursors to heart disease. So those students who were high in hardiness were somewhat protected from cardiovascular related problems. Next slide, please. I'm doing on time. Okay, this is a little bit of an older study where we looked at soldiers in the first Gulf War, and we measured their hardiness levels. We measured PTSD symptomatology, and we measured stress in terms of combat and combat-related exposures, things like being shot at, having buddies killed, and that kind of thing. And what we found was that hardiness was a moderator of the impact of combat-related stress, war zone-related stress on PTSD symptoms. And the graph depicts the impact of combat stress on high hardy and low hardy soldiers, where if you look to the right side of the chart, the high hardy soldiers are represented in the lower line. It's the blue line, where the low hardy are up above that on the dotted line. Now, so what you see is that as stress goes up, PTSD symptoms increase pretty much for everybody, but they increase quite a bit more for the for the low hardy soldiers. Now, one takeaway from this slide is that hardiness is not a silver bullet. It's not a panacea. It doesn't mean that you don't experience, to be high in hardiness doesn't mean you don't experience stress or symptoms. You do. But everybody suffers to some degree, but hardiness really does operate as a buffer and helps to keep stress-related symptoms down at a lower level. We still don't know why. We have some ideas about what the mechanisms may be, but that's the point of that study. Next slide, please. This next study was done more recently with U.S. soldiers returning from war in Afghanistan. I did this a few years ago. And here, we administered hardiness and a few other things. And we looked at depression as an outcome. And you see that on the far right side of the chart. And here we found a couple of things. One, we saw that avoidance coping, or the tendency to cope with stress, was actually used much more frequently by soldiers who were low in hardiness. So avoidance coping was a mediator of the influence of hardiness on depression. So first of all, again, I don't want to get too much into the details, but hardiness had a direct effect, or in a sense, a main effect on depression. It also had an indirect effect operating through coping strategy, with the low hardy soldiers tending toward avoidance coping, things like alcohol and denial, versus high hardy soldiers who were inclined more to deal directly or cope directly with the stress. The other important issue here was that combat exposure had a moderating influence on this whole relationship, so that when combat exposure levels were high, the influence of hardiness on depression, in particular as on this pathway through avoidance coping, was much more significant. So once again, we see that hardiness seems to have its greater influence when stress levels are high. Okay, the other takeaway here is that coping, how one's actual coping behaviors, are one of the ways, at least, probably a very important way, in which hardiness has its impact on mental health outcomes. It's also been seen with physical health outcomes as well. Okay, next slide, please. And I'm going to try to speed this up, and I might even skip some of these slides in the interest of time. Hardiness, another study that was done recently, we looked at a cross-section of U.S. workers in a variety of occupations, and we saw that hardiness has a protective effect against burnout. Again, the study's available for anyone that really wants to get into the details. Next slide, please. A somewhat larger study, you know, I'm talking a lot about studies that I've done and that I had a hand in. This was a rather large study that was done in Italy, and it's part of a series of studies that have been done by Monia Vagni and colleagues. But in this study, they looked at first responders following the first wave of the COVID pandemic in Italy. And we can recall that Italy was really one of the first countries that where the COVID pandemic had really a huge impact. And at any rate, they looked at first responders, emergency medical technicians, and Red Cross workers, and found the primary result, the most important result, was that high hardy, those workers who were high in hardiness, and they measured this before and during, but those who were high in hardy had less or showed less stress-related burnout. And an interesting sidelight was that volunteer workers, and these were mostly Red Cross workers, also were somewhat more resilient in dealing with COVID-related stress. And they're dealing with a lot of patients who were suffering badly, and many of whom died. So there were some very substantial stressors associated with this line of work. But for some reason, those who volunteered versus those who were required as part of their normal jobs to be doing this work, those who were volunteers were less susceptible to burnout. We can wonder and maybe discuss why that might be true. I've actually seen that in a number of other studies where volunteers may have to do with volition, the sense of control that I'm here because I want to be here, not because I have to be here. And so, you know, we might relate that to the control dimension of hardiness. Next slide, please. I'm probably speaking too fast, and my hat goes off to the translator. If you're able to translate most of what I am saying into Ukrainian, I really respect and admire you for that. This study very quickly just looked at alcohol and to some degree drug abuse, but alcohol abuse as an outcome. And this was also in soldiers returning from Afghanistan. And once again, those who were low in hardiness showed significantly more alcohol abuse, heavy drinking, binge drinking, that kind of thing, and also avoidance coping. So avoidance once again showed up as a mediating factor. And incidentally, this was replicated, and this is part of the same report. It was replicated in a sample of Norwegian army soldiers who had returned from Kosovo. Next slide, please. Okay, another study that we did this time looking at a cross-section of Canadian working adults. And we again found that hardiness was a moderator in the COVID-related, in the relation between COVID stress, COVID-related stressors, and both anxiety and depression. To the next slide, please. Skipping over this. A somewhat older study. This is one that actually has been cited quite a lot. we had a chance to measure hardiness in several cohorts of Army Special Forces trainees or candidates for Special Forces qualification. It's a very rigorous, high-stress course. There's about a 50% failure rate, and of a whole battery of psychological tests that were given to these candidates. Hardiness was, including the MMPI and a lot of psychopathology measures, hardiness was the only instrument that actually was found to distinguish or to be able to predict candidates who graduated, who succeeded in the course, versus those who failed and dropped out. Okay, to the next slide, please. Something quite similar was found in a study I had nothing to do with, but was done in the Netherlands with Dutch basic trainees, where it turned out that hardiness also was a significant predictor of success in the course, or successful course completion. And my understanding or inference is that this is at a time when the Dutch military was still an all volunteer, just like the U.S. was an all volunteer, largely a volunteer military. I believe in more recent years they've reverted to more of a conscription model for a variety of reasons. Next slide, please. Trying to watch my clock here. In an all-volunteer force like the U.S. military, one of the more stressful jobs is recruiters. We have military, mainly senior non-commissioned officers, whose only job it is to recruit candidates. They go out to the high schools, they go out into the community, and they try to convince young men and women to sign on the dotted line, to join the military. And, you know, depending on a lot of factors, it can be very difficult. You know, military is a dangerous job, as everyone here knows very well. So especially when they have a lot of other job opportunities, a lot of these young people don't necessarily want to join the military. And our recruiters have monthly quotas. So their performance is rated based upon their success in bringing in new candidates. So we were able to look at a representative sample of military Army recruiters, and it turned out that and measured hardiness, and hardiness was one of a very few that measures that we looked at that distinguished or predicted success in recruiters. So we didn't really look at really look at moderators or mediators. It wasn't a real sophisticated study, but we did see that those recruiters who were more successful, and this was in terms of supervisor ratings, not self ratings, but supervisor ratings, so a bit more objective measures of performance were also higher in hardiness. Next slide, please. Just a couple of, and go to the next slide, please. A couple of final studies that relate more specifically to how hardiness can help in dealing with the stress of loss and death. Okay, a few years ago, quite a few years ago, actually, the Army experienced a tragic plane crash which killed everyone on board. There were no survivors, but it killed 248 soldiers from the 101st, the very famous kind of storied 101st Airborne Division based in Fort Campbell, Kentucky. And this was a plane load of soldiers it was a charter airline. They were on their way home from a deployment in the Sinai. Happened to be a UN Blue Hat mission, but at any rate, they were all killed. It was it was really a community disaster for the community of Fort Campbell, for the soldiers, for the families, for the leaders. And in fact, Jim Martin was one of the researchers that was involved in looking at the aftermath of this study. And so I've been having some conversations with Jim about this recently. At any rate, one of the special areas that I focused in on was what we called survivor assistance officers at Fort Campbell. And these were military officers, sometimes NCOs. Oftentimes they were buddies of the soldiers that were killed, who were just pulled off a roster and told, okay, your job is to go out and support the family members, mostly widows and orphan children of the soldiers that were killed. It's a very tough job. These are not the notification officers, the ones who go out and knock on the door and give the horrible news to the family members. That's another group that we also looked at. But in this case, it's the survivor assistance officers. And these officers and NCOs have a longer duration, a longer period of contact with the family. They help with administrative matters. They help with the planning of the funeral. They help with military honors, all of those things. And they end up, in most cases, getting quite close to the family. It's a tough job. They're dealing with a lot of emotion. They're dealing with a lot of administrative delays and problems. There's a great deal of stress. You may call it secondary grief in many cases, or a kind of a vicarious grief that many of them experience. Very high stress job. The only result, we found quite a number of interesting things, but the main takeaway here is that hardiness, as well as social support from family members and from co-workers and leaders in particular, were very important resilience dimensions, if you will, or contributors to resilience in the face of this kind of grief and stress that these the survivor assistance officers experienced. And in terms of the outcomes that were looked at, it was well-being, and it was psychological well-being. It was mental health, a couple of measures of mental health, and it was physical and mental health symptoms. Okay, next slide, please. And I'll mention this one more quickly. And this was a more recent study that I did with a colleague at NDU, Stephen Bowles, where we had an opportunity to study severely injured Army and Marine soldiers who were brought back from Iraq. And these were mostly IED and RPG victims who were amputees, in some cases double and triple amputees. Relatively small sample, but very unusual to be able to study a group like this. And we actually conducted this research while they were patients at Walter Reed in Washington, D.C. And they're all going through what you can imagine was very painful, very difficult rehabilitation and multiple surgeries, and experiencing the loss of a limb or multiple limbs. the loss of the ability to work, the ability to do things that you used to do. So grief comes in many forms, of course. We think about grief mostly as something we experience when someone we love dies. Well, yes, that's true, but there's a whole range of losses that we all experience that that generate feelings of grief. So we looked at the soldiers as well as their spouses, and what we found quite interesting was that those who were higher in hardiness showed continuing higher levels of psychological well-being, as well as not just reduced symptomatology, but also an increase in post-traumatic growth, which we were able to measure in this study using a standard instrument for measuring post-traumatic growth. Wow, I'm slipping behind in my time frame. Next slide, please. And we can go to the next slide. I'll speak briefly about some of the ways that are available to build or increase hardiness. And first of all, formal training programs, coaching, therapy. There are a number of these programs that have been developed that are out there. We probably have some clinical folks in the audience. So you can approach this clinically. And Sal Maddy, who's one of the originators of the hardiness concept, developed a program which was quite successful. It's been around for 30 years or more, which he called hardiness induction. And that's been in use with various samples. The nursing profession, folks in the nursing world have also developed hardiness training programs, which have appear to be working quite well. And there are a number of research outcome studies that have shown increases in hardiness for people that go through the training, and also evidence that the increases in hardiness or hardiness mindset do persist at least for 6 months and up to a year. Perhaps in the Q&A we can talk more about that. But these programs, what they have in common is it's typically done in a group format, you know, small groups, although it can be done with individuals. And there's a discussion, in some cases kind of a reconstruction of stressful events, stressful encounters that have occurred or that are specific to the people getting the training, whether that's nurses, executives, soldiers, or whatever. And then there's an emphasis on a discussion of what did you do to cope or to deal with the stressful encounter, and maybe what are some of the alternative approaches that you might have used, perhaps more constructive, problem-oriented approaches to dealing or coping with the stress. Next slide, please. There's a lot more we could say about that, but that's enough for now. Excuse me. Here, I just want to briefly mention experiential learning to build hardiness. And this is kind of discovered by accident. We didn't set out to develop hardiness through regular kind of normal training experiences that mainly soldiers and military people go through. But we've discovered that this kind of thing can actually increase one's hardiness. And what are we talking about? We're talking about training exercises where we deliberately, artificially to some degree, increase the stress levels. We create some kind of simulated stress environment. We're providing challenging, stressful tasks for people to perform. And typically when this works best, it's done in a gradual way. So we follow a kind of a crawl, walk, run, a gradually increased levels of difficulty. So the tasks require some stretch, but they're doable. Supportive instructors and feedback, and that's critical. And then debriefing and a chance to reflect. Next slide, please. Running short on time, so I think I'll skip through this, but suffice it to say that this has been done. We've seen the increases in hardiness in a training exercise that is done every year with military medical students out in San Diego. In fact, Carl, not too far from where you are, at a former Hollywood movie studio, where for a week, these medical students are put through very realistic combat scenarios where their job is to make decisions, to do triage, to actually do life-saving emergency surgeries. And this is done on real live human patients who are dressed up in a special, what's called a cut suit, a kind of an anatomical torso, which actually has real simulated human organs and will bleed when it's cut into. So it's extremely realistic. The stress levels are quite high. But one of the things that's done here is that the action is stopped in particular after a stressful scenario. The action is stopped and they sit down and they discuss what happened. What did you do? What went right? What went wrong? And what can we learn from the experience? So there's actually a published study showing, and there's more coming, more on the way, that hardiness measured pre and post, that hardiness increased quite substantially in these students from before exercise to post exercise. And this is an area it's a very exciting area for future research, because there's the potential to, with maybe some tweaks and adjustments in how the training is approached, there's the potential to build in, if you will, some hardiness-oriented training into existing military exercises. And this could be done with very little effort, very little, if any, cost. And so it would be a kind of a real-world intervention that doesn't really add anything onto the plate that would increase potentially resilience in military groups and perhaps other groups as well. Next slide, please. Whoa. Okay, finally. Okay, some self-help steps to strengthen hardiness. I'll just mention a couple because we're running short on time. You build hardiness commitment by spending more time actually focused on and thinking about what's important and interesting to you. What means a lot to you, and how am I spending my time? Do I need to spend more time on it? And take pride in your past successes. We can build control. So these are things that we can do for ourselves, okay? It takes effort. It's not going to happen automatically. But you can do this through self-talk and exercises and self-discipline. Control. Focus your energy on things that you can control, not things that are out of your control. And yes, sometimes it's hard to tell the difference, but to your best ability, focus on things that you can influence. And when you're faced with uncontrollable situations, try to reorient and pay more attention to what you things that you can control. I'll say a little more about that momentarily. And for challenge, just a couple of items to highlight. Challenge is about change, remember. Be willing to adjust and change your strategy depending upon the environment and what's going on, when conditions change. And a real key is when you fail at something, and we all fail, when you're disappointed, when things go wrong, always ask yourself, what can I learn from this? And that's a very powerful way to extract something positive from negative experiences. Next slide, please. Forgive me, I'm running a little bit over. Oksana, am I okay to take 2 more minutes?
Yes, please do. Thank you.
All right, thank you. What can we do? How do we translate this into what we're all, most of us, experiencing today, more on a kind of a day-to-day basis? When tragedy strikes, what can we do? And it's related to hardiness. First of all, accept, recognize, don't deny, recognize and accept that you accept the loss, and it hurts. It's painful. But don't do what a lot of people tend to do, which is deny it and ignore it. So that's step number one. You've got to face your loss, and then allow yourself time to grieve. And a lot of times this is difficult, especially for soldiers out in operations or for medical personnel. But if you can't at the moment, you have to go on with the operation. Don't forget, at some point, you have to stop the train and allow yourself time to cry. Next, you want to memorialize the loved ones. How do you do this? You do many ways to do this: with pictures, with objects, with activities, things that were important to them, that you want to hold on to, that you want to remember, that you want to share with others. It's very important. It helps you kind of put the loss, in some respect, in a healthy place. You're not forgetting it. You're holding on to it. You're holding on to the love, but at the same time, you're putting it in a safe place, which helps you to go on with your own life. It's very helpful to turn your attention to others. You're not the only one suffering loss and grief. We found this after the Gander crash. We've seen it in many disaster situations. You're dealing with your own grief, but if you can turn your attention to some degree to helping others, your own family, your kids, your neighbors, your friends who are also dealing with loss, and work on helping them, that helps you deal with your own loss. Put your energy and engage in activities that pay homage, give honor to your lost loved ones. And you're always also setting an example for others. We see this so clearly in the military. It's very important for leaders to do all of these things and to create an environment where these kinds of things are allowed to happen and encouraged to happen. Jim Martin recently wrote a very interesting chapter on grief leadership, and I commend that to you. I've put the reference here at the bottom of the slide. What leaders do is very important in helping the people around them to cope in a more effective way with grief. And everybody listening today is in one way or another a leader. If you're not leading a group, you're a leader for your own family. You're a leader for your for your neighbors. People will also look to you for how to respond. One quick story. I had a friend, and then we'll hopefully show this clip and then have some time to discuss. But one of my good friends out here in Michigan had a son who was studying to be a military doctor. He actually had joined the Air Force, and he was going to be an Air Force doctor. He was in his final year of medical school out at University of Michigan in Ann Arbor when a couple of thugs broke into his dormitory. They wanted to steal things, and he got up and gave resistance, and he was shot and killed. Very tragic. His father, who lives not far from me, father and son used to love to go camping together. But one of the things that the dad did in the throes of his grief and loss was he started a firewood business, kind of in memory of his son. So he would go out and chop wood. He still does it today. The son was killed about 5 years ago, and he sells wood piles to people that that burn wood in their fireplace, and all of the proceeds are donated to support military and medical students. So this is the dad found a way, a constructive activity that he puts his energy into, that every day he's paying honor and respect to his son. It's an activity that was kind of meaningful for the son, meaningful for the father. And those are the kind of things that can be extremely helpful when we're confronting a loss of our own. So finally, my last point is I do want to mention the TAPS Ukraine group. I've talked a lot about, go to the next slide, please. Tragedy assistance program for survivors, a wonderful program started by a woman who lost her own husband in a plane crash some 25, 30 years ago, Bonnie Carroll. And they provide peer support services for survivors of a military death. And they've done great work in this country for military families and children and widows and moms and dads. And they've in recent years extended that work out into Ukraine and Afghanistan and some other countries. It's a form of social support, which also contributes, kind of like Hardiness does, to resilience. And actually, it feeds back into Hardiness and the kinds of activities and coping strategies that Hardy people use. Well, I've really gone over time. I apologize for that. Do we have time to show a 3-minute video clip, Oksana, which describes the TAPS Ukraine activity?
Mm-hmm. Is this for our technician?
Yeah.
Please show us.
And then we'll still have a few moments for discussion, I hope.
Збережи своє життя. Звернись до психологів ТАПС. Місія благодійного фонду ТАПС – захистити і врятувати життя кожного українця, який постраждав від російської агресії та геноциду в Україні. Допомогти жити під час або після війни повноцінним життям. ТАПС є членом міжнародної організації TAPS International, заснованої в США для підтримки людей, що переживають втрату близької людини, військовослужбовця. Ми хочемо зберегти ментальне здоров'я нації і приділяємо багато сил розвитку різних напрямків психологічної роботи. Психоемоційна підтримка військових, родин загиблих героїв. Психологічна підтримка волонтерів. психологічна робота з дітьми-переселенцями та дітьми-свідками війни. Формування спільноти, родин загиблих героїв з метою взаємної підтримки. – 24 лютого 2022. Сьогодні ТАПС створили великий координаційний штаб волонтерів Дніпра і почали допомагати переселенцям і українським захисникам із Збройних сил України, а також активно надавати психологічну підтримку родинам загиблих героїв. Завдяки постійній співпраці із психологами громадської організації «Кризова психологічна допомога міста Дніпро та Дніпропетровської області» більше 70 психологів щоденно допомагають людям, постраждалим від війни. Звернутися за психологічною допомогою можна на гарячу лінію благодійного фонду ТАПС за номером телефону 099 337 16 52 або на сайті taps.org.ua.
And at any rate, the important thing is just to let people know that TAPS Ukraine is there on the ground. They're working very actively in a number of ways to provide support for Ukrainian families, including children who have lost loved ones in the current conflict. And while we're waiting, I don't know if we have anyone from TAPS Ukraine, but Chantel, did you want to say anything regarding TAPS Ukraine? Or anybody?
Yes,
Yeah,
absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Bartone. We are so humbled to be able to work with and partner with TAPS Ukraine. We have been to Ukraine many, many times. Our president and founder, Bonnie Carroll, was just there with the team this past October. They have started grief camps for surviving family members as well as children to attend. And it is about focusing on the lives lived and the service given in defense of the nation's freedom. We are so grateful for anyone on the call. If you are wanting to learn more, please do reach out. We have representatives that are both in Ukraine and also here in the States. And our hearts are with you, and know that you are not alone.
thank you. Yeah, thank you, Chantal.
Дякуємо лектору.
Chantel, I
Thank you
just
very much.
I might mention that TAPS in the U.S. has numerous resources on your website. I don't know whether there's some effort to try to either provide some translation for some of these or other ways of sharing them. But it's a tremendous resource, not only for families, but for those working who have experienced grief and loss of a military loved one.
Thank you very much, Mr. And yes, sir, I will post the link to the website in the chat for anybody who would like it. And they have translated one of our books, Healing Your Grieving Heart, into Ukrainian, as well as several other resources that are available through TAPS Ukraine. Thank you very much.
Well, it looks like the video, thank you, Chantel. It looks like you'll have to watch the video on your own, but I hope that I've been able to communicate something of what Hardiness is about and how a Hardiness mindset can facilitate healthy coping with grief and loss, as well as other stressors in life. And at this point, if there's time for any additional comments or questions, I'd be happy to respond or listen or learn from you. I don't know how
Шановні
this
слухачі,
should go, Jim, or
ми запрошуємо так до питань, можна писати їх,
Yeah,
друкувати.
we want to encourage all the participants to ask their questions. They can write them down in the Q&A box, or they can virtually raise their hand and we will unmute their mics. Well, I have one question. It's my personal question, and the team of translators had a question about that as well. Can you briefly explain what the difference is between resilience and hardiness? Because on the one hand, we have like resilience to stress, right? And hardiness is basically a set of qualities, skills, and characteristics. It's just a question out of curiosity. I mean, what is the division line there?
yes, and that's a good question. Thank you. And it's one that comes up quite often. As I tried to say kind of early in my talk, there are a lot of factors that contribute to resilience. Resilience is really, we think about resilience as bouncing back quickly from stress and being able to go on with your normal life existence. And it is that. But that doesn't explain how do people get to be resilient. How do we get to be resilient? That's what lies under that. Those resilient behaviors or responses. It's all well and good to say, well, yeah, he's resilient, she's resilient, he's not resilient. And we can kind of see this in people we observe, but it doesn't tell us how they got to be that way. And the value of a factor of something like hardiness is that it tells us more specifically something about how you get to be resilient. So if you wanted to train resilience, I don't know, where would you start? We don't know what goes into it. Well, people have ideas, and that's what hardiness is. It's one factor that goes into resilience, but there are others. Social support from your family, from peers. What kind of boss you're working for. A lot of things go into it. Whether you are hungry or well-fed. So lots of factors affect resilience. Hardiness is the number one, for my money, inside the person factor that affects resilience. And furthermore, knowing that, or if you kind of accept that even tentatively, it gives you an avenue, a pathway, ideas for how to increase that in yourself and others around you. Some of the things that I mentioned. You can build your hardiness mindset. And so that's the main difference. A lot of factors contribute to resilience. Hardiness is just one. We want to think about others and be mindful of other factors as well. Thank you for that. Hope that answers your question. Thank you.
Питання з секції Q&A. Якщо я не маю досвіду роботи з військовими,
There is a question. If I don't have any experience of working with the military and I was approached by an active service member, is it appropriate for me to work with an active service member as a civilian therapist? And maybe if it makes sense for me to take this client, I need to use something different than usual psychotherapy. Thank you.
Right. Well, thank you for that. That question takes me a little bit out of my area of expertise. I really have no knowledge of what your specific situation may be there in Ukraine. I can tell you that here in the States, that question has come up quite a lot, in part because oftentimes we have a shortage of clinical personnel, whether that's clinical psychologists or clinical social workers in the military. We don't have enough to meet the demand, the need for all of the soldiers. Well, this was more true at the height of the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts. It's thankfully a little less true today, but we did have to turn to civilian clinicians to help us with the workload. And there are a number of obstacles to face there, but it can be worked out. One of the key ones that came up and still comes up, and I don't know, Jim, if you want to speak to this, but it goes to the issue of, I guess for the shorthand term is cultural awareness or cultural sensitivity. It can be very difficult for a civilian clinician to come in and work with the military, even if you work out all the legal issues and maybe financial issues for pay and reimbursement. But if the civilian provider has really no knowledge or familiarity with the military culture, with the military world, then it can be difficult to form a therapeutic bond, if you will, rapport with the client. It's not impossible, and you can get over that, but it's one of the reasons why peer support works so well in whatever the domain. It's because the person who's giving the support, the therapy, the coaching, understands, has been through, knows what the soldier is experiencing, can talk the language, can talk the talk and walk the walk. So, but to really answer your question, I'd have to turn it over to someone like Ola, who's on the line, who is works within the Ukraine military as a psychiatrist. Maybe Zoran Komar. I'm not sure if you would like to respond to that question. Thank you. Any of you?
Okay.
Can civilian providers in the Ukraine get involved and help with the military families or soldiers who are experiencing loss of a buddy or whatever? Thank you.
I can tell you from Croatian experience, we were faced with this problem during the war and after the war period, because we had many of psychologists in combat units, but without possibility to make psychotherapy. And psychotherapists, mostly psychiatrists, were civilians. It caused a lot of problems after the war, because to be a part of combat unit gives you some, or be a professional soldier as a psychologist or as a psychiatrist, give you a special legitimacy to working with soldiers or war veterans. I think that's the problem in many countries, or in most countries. But if I have an opportunity to speak, let me first of all to thank you to Oleg, who invited me on this meeting. I'm very happy to see Paul after 25 years. My God, Paul, you look just exactly young, but with the white hair, it's give you some special charm. So I hope that I see you before the 25 years passed away.
Thank you, Zoran. You as well.
Thank you all. For those who see me for the first time, I was head of military psychology service in Croatian army during the war period and several years after the war. And after that, I was involved in war veterans problems. I was assistant to the minister and deputy minister in the Ministry of War Veterans. So I'm fully in these topics, working with soldiers and especially today with war veterans. That's my CV in shortly.
Paul, I make a comment here. I think maybe the most important thing, and you highlighted it, is developing an interest and an understanding to some degree of military culture and experience in Ukraine. The reality is that every mental health provider in Ukraine is going to experience, to some degree, individuals who have been directly or secondarily impacted by this war. It is so pervasive. There are so many of your countrymen and women who are engaged either directly or indirectly in this war that it's impossible for anyone to not encounter this in your practice. And so it's important to always ask, whether it's the individual or a family member, have you been impacted by this war and how? And if you're asking that question, you have to be prepared to listen, which means you have to know something about the military experience. And how could you not, given what's happening every day? And then secondarily, if you're going to open the door to your client, you're going to have to be willing and prepared to hear things that may be very difficult to hear, that come from the experiences, especially those experiences of direct combat. Some of your countrymen, will have not only themselves been injured, but will have lost fellow unit members. Family members will have lost loved ones. I'm circling back to TAPS and the work they do to remind us that parents and siblings of soldiers who are killed and injured are profoundly impacted by that experience. So it's a willingness to ask, have you served? Has someone you love been infected directly or indirectly by the war? And then be willing to listen to very difficult stories that are going to be challenging. And it means that for you as a clinician, it's important that you have your own support network, people who you can talk with about those experiences. I can tell you from looking at what we've experienced in the United States and our wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and I work with civilian providers, to even include now as they work with veterans of these wars. These are important issues. So be willing to ask and be willing to listen.
Питання, шановні колеги. Я бачу, що у нас трішки зовсім часу, тому читаю. Що сказати бійцям?
Colleagues, one more question. What do we tell to military servicemen who want to pull on the grenade not to be captured?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that question. Could you say it again?
Що сказати бійцю, який кожен...
What can we tell to a serviceman who pulls on the grenade, the hand grenade, each time to avoid getting captured, getting into captivity?
Not really clear context, or I also didn't get.
Pull on a hand grenade. You mean a soldier who was killed by a hand grenade, or?
No, I think they're asking about soldiers that would rather pull the pin for a hand grenade to avoid being captured. They would rather risk their life by explosion of a hand grenade in lieu of being captured. What do you tell those soldiers that are disclosing that they're willing to do that so they do not get captured?
Well, that is quite a question. I guess if it were up to me, I would try to refocus that soldier on the value of being alive, even if he or she captured. There's still hope. There's still opportunity to be released and to be able to take care of your family and your friends. So, but I don't know. It really would have to depend on the circumstances. I can imagine some situations where it might be better to die than to be taken captive. But, you know, that would be, I think, quite unusual. So I guess I would try to just encourage that soldier to think about the future and the importance of being able to stay alive and be able to take care of your buddies sometime in the future and your family. Over. Anybody else want to weigh in? Jim, you want to weigh in on that, or Ola?
Yeah, the only thing I can say is in the US, that situation has come up more directly with Air Force pilots. And those folks go through very extensive training as to what would happen and what to do if you become a prisoner of war. It's not my expertise, but I remember from some of that, the most important issues, Paul, as you've referenced in Hardiness, is this issue of a sense of control. That even in situations where it would appear that, you know, everything has been sort of taken away, that if you can maintain some sense of that you do have control, even of little things. I'm reminded, and you know, stretching my memory here, but in America, our most famous, in a sense, prisoner of war was Senator John McCain, who had run for president in America. And some of you may be familiar with his name. And he has actually written about some of his experiences in Hanoi, where he was kept prisoner of war in very horrific situations of stress and trauma. And even when he was given the opportunity to be released because his father was a very famous admiral in our Navy, he chose not to be released, and he stayed with his peers in that prisoner camp. But again, the issues that I remember from this are those issues of how you can have some sense of control, even in situations where everything seems absent. Paul has talked about this in another context. If you think about our wounded veterans, those who are amputees or double amputees, their lives have been dramatically changed. And for many of them, it becomes an issue of how can you build into that moment some sense of control of themselves, their body, their environment, and even little things that reflect control can be powerful influences in terms of their well-being and moving forward in those situations. That's really the best I can offer. But there are people who have studied these areas, and Carl and I can maybe think about a future presentation that might be more directly related to this.
Колега пояснила, яка ставила це питання, коли
The
військовий...
colleague who asked the question, she clarified that that particular serviceman has already had the experience of being a prisoner of war and would not get captured another time. We will probably have one more question. We are running out of time. How do we support a person in grief? What can friends do or acquaintances when they tell some horrible stories on the phone about the death of a buddy? What can I do if I myself want to cry when I hear it?
Yes, well, that's a hard one. Some of the things I mentioned that are important, you do have to allow the grief to occur. Don't deny it, and that's hard. It's painful for the person going through it. It's painful and hard for the person listening. If you're doing it over the phone, and TAPS does a lot of over the phone peer support, it's probably even more difficult in some respects. But some of the things that I mentioned on my final slide that can be done at least over the longer term is find ways to memorialize, to honor your lost loved one with things or with activities, like the fellow I mentioned who cuts and sells firewood in memory of his son. Those kinds of things are very helpful, in part because it helps you remember and honor your lost loved one. You're not denying the loss, but you're also moving forward and doing something constructive and kind of reestablishing control over your life. But that's kind of over the longer term. Chantel, did you want to say, and you've got to, as Jim was saying, you've got to take care of yourself too. Find ways to do the self-care. Otherwise, you will burn out. And it is hard work. I don't think I could do it. Chantel, did you want to comment on the difficulty or any advice for counselors?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much. And to the person who asked the question, the fact that you are asking the question is a beautiful gift. And first and foremost, the best thing to do when somebody is sharing those awful moments that will forever have changed their lives is to be there, is to acknowledge what has happened and know that it is not your responsibility to fix it, because you can't fix it. It has happened, and this is something they are going to have to live with for the rest of their life. The best form of support is to be present and to be that listening ear for them to be able to share, what they're trying to process themselves. We say that there's 3 things that can really happen from the perspective of the person that is bearing witness to the trauma or the death of a loved one. And that's first and foremost is to acknowledge that what has happened to them has actually happened in whatever magnitude that looks like. And to them, this is the end of their life as they know it. Their world will never be the same now that they've lived through this trauma or the loss of a loved one. The second thing is to validate their emotions that they're feeling. It is okay to feel those overwhelming emotions of grief. And we like to use the phrase with our peer supporters that it's okay to cry to the end of your tears. Don't try to stop crying or, put yourself together. Let it all out. Because holding that in can cause further problems and to include physical problems as well. And then the third thing is to make sure that you are supporting them with positive ways to cope with their grief. If they enjoy knitting, then, positive ways to knit. If they enjoy being physical, then it is physical exercise. Something that is positive instead of harmful. And then the last part, as Dr. Bartone had mentioned, is to move forward with them so they are not alone, to help for that meaning and purpose, finding new ways to cherish the memory of the life they lived rather than that moment and manner of death, which so beautifully folds into what Dr. Bartone mentions about hardiness. It is focusing on what you can control and cherishing those memories in a positive way as they move forward in a healthy manner. But it is very important that this is going to be a long process. It will not happen overnight. They're going to have good days and they're going to have really bad days. But the most important thing is to be there and be present for them.
Thank you so much, Chantel. And if I may say so, Chantel knows what she's talking about. She lost her own Air Force fiance in a tragic motor vehicle accident just shortly before they were to be married. And that was just a few short years ago. So Chantel knows what she's talking about. Thank you, Chantel.
Дуже дякую нашим лекторам. Щиро вдячна за те,
We
що
are
ви нам
very grateful to our lectors today for such an interesting event. We will post the video in our social network. We know that people do come back and look again and listen again. We're grateful to our interpreters. We love you and we value you. And we're grateful to our participants for your presence and your questions. Hope to see you again. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. Bye for now.